Hey folks, this week we continue our discussion on the theory of independent music, right? So last week we set up this picture. This picture is kind of setting up the problem, and what it expresses is the idea that the total amount of money that's available to be spent on music in the world is basically the amount of money that each person contributes to pay for their music through concert tickets or paying for recordings, crowdfunding, what have you. These are the musicians. These are the folks who are being supported by that. And then there's this little cost factor that has to do with the cost of doing business, right? The cost of producing the music, also the cost of website transactions or credit card fees or things like that. So what we said last week was that if we look at this overall economy on the whole, that we could turn it into an equation. So that's what I want to talk about this week. I want to set up the equation because the mathematical equation is what lets us start to play around with numbers and find some interesting things. So let's talk about the audience half first. One member of the audience has a certain amount of money. That's the money for that audience member that they are willing to spend on music, say in a year or whatever, right? That's one person's amount of money. That's going to change, right? Some people are really into music and they're willing to pay a lot. Other people, probably they don't pay much at all for their music, right? They just listen to whatever's on the radio and they don't think twice about it. Okay. Now, if you want to talk about the total amount of money now that's entering the economy to support music, then you have to take this amount for that one person and you have to add it up with everybody else's, right? So in math, we have this cool capital sigma, which represents a sum, and we're going to sum up that amount of money over all the members of the audience. That's the symbol for all. So this total amount of money now can be expressed with this expression here, right? Summing up the amount of money for each person, you get the total. Okay, now on the other side, you have the musicians, right? We're going to do something similar. Each musician has an income that would sustain them, right? This is sort of just their sustainable, make-a-living kind of income, right? Each musician also has these costs that are associated with their music. Again, going to be different for every musician. You know, the amount of money for somebody to make a living, that's probably roughly the same for most people, but it might change a little bit. But the production costs can be different, right? Depends on the type of music you're making, how you make it, what types of resources you need. Again, for most independent musicians, we would hope that this number would be relatively low compared to the overall income that they need to sustain themselves overall. Now, if we want to know the total amount of money in the economy, we have to add that up for all musicians. So we do the same thing. We're going to take a sum over all musicians of these two factors. Now, trying to work with this equation in this form is a little bit tricky, right? We don't have the data of what every single person in the world is willing to spend on music. We certainly can maybe estimate some of these cost numbers. This we could probably get a rough idea, right, in terms of cost of living in different places. But in order to manipulate the equation, make it easier to work with, it'd be better if we could kind of like work with some reasonable estimates. So one way to estimate the sum of the amount of money that all people might spend on music is to take an average, right? Let's take the average amount of money that an audience member spends on music and just multiply it by the number of audience members, right? So the total amount of money that's entering the economy is the number of members in the audience for independent music times the average amount of money that that person might spend, okay? On the other side, we can do the same thing. Take that income figure, take the cost figure, take averages of each one, and multiply it by the number of musicians. Okay? This equation now is much easier to work with. Granted, these are going to be estimates, they're averages, but the equation on the whole stands, right? The average amount of money that one person would spend times the number of people should tell you the total amount of money in the economy. Same thing here on the income and cost side for each musician. Now, when we start to play with this equation, we're going to be able to manipulate it and ask ourselves some kinds of interesting questions. And as a sneak preview, This is one of the figures that I think is most interesting, but we'll talk about that next week. Thanks. All right, for a music link this week, I want to reach back to an artist that was actually featured in a video last season. I did a series of 3 videos about the definition of music, what makes something music or not. And in those videos, I picked samples from different artists that I felt were kind of on the spectrum of stuff that's very traditional that most people would consider music, reaching back to stuff that's just way out there that some people might just think of as noise, and then there were some things in the middle. So one of these artists from the middle is actually an artist that is part of the Share the Love concept on my Patreon campaign. So a fraction of 10% of my Patreon funds that are raised are going back out to other artists on Patreon. That's the Share the Love idea. So I'm always looking occasionally for other artists on Patreon that I might want to share the love with. So one of the artists I have found is this artist by the name of Khate Gausman, and she does some really interesting work. She does looping and sampling and that kind of stuff, but she also does much more sort of like experimental, like I don't necessarily want to call it lo-fi because it's not even about fidelity. It's just about experimentation. She's a circuit bender, which means that she takes devices that make sound and modifies them and messes with them. She takes like old speak and spells from like, you know, the 80s or whatever and like messes with the guts and makes them make different sounds. So her work's really interesting. One of the tracks of hers that I used in that definition of music video, I actually got some varied responses on. One of my supporters actually said, "Wow, this music is actually, you know, very negatively, evocative for me." And it was a piece called Eightfold House, it was a little bit kind of spooky, actually, a little bit strange and weird. The track I want to link you to is a little bit more based on her looping and sampling type stuff. It's called Tubby, and as you'll see in the description on her video, it is something that was taken from almost entirely from samples from a particular record that she like looped and messed with, and the record was damaged, so it has like a lot of record noise on it and skips on it and stuff. But she turned it into this fun video and where she featured her cat, who also happens to be called Tubby. Anyway, I find her work really interesting. She's doing things in that middle spectrum area where some of it's pretty musical and then some of it gets like really into the world of sound art, and she kind of explores that space. In doing that, she definitely serves as one of these artists who helps me to think outside the box, right? I listen to her stuff and think, wow, this is cool. Listen to what you can make out of these modified analog devices, or listen to what you can make out of these samples of broken records or what have you. And, it helps get my own wheels turning about the different types of things that you can do with music and with sound. And I find that inspiring. I like listening to artists that help bring me outside of just the more traditional, comfortable space that I've been in. So hope you enjoy it. Khate Gausman, part of the Share the Love aspect of my Patreon campaign. Hope you find something there you find interesting.